The sudden and total collapse of the Knights Templar, that most formidable and mysterious of medieval military orders, remains one of history's most staggering reversals of fortune. For here was a brotherhood that had, for nearly 2 centuries, stood as the very backbone of Crusader Christendom, wielding immense military power, operating vast transnational banking networks, and enjoying the exclusive protection of the papal throne. Yet within a single calendar year, and indeed with shocking speed over a few fateful days in October 1307, this mighty edifice was reduced to ashes. Its leaders were burned at the stake. Its properties were seized. Its surviving members were scattered into oblivion. So that the question of how and why this overnight vanishing occurred compels us to look not at a single cause, but at a perfect storm of royal greed, papal weakness, financial dependency, military failure, and a dramatic shift in European political geography. These factors rendered the Templars not merely obsolete, but dangerously inconvenient to the rising nation-states of the West. To understand the vanishing, we must first appreciate that the Templars were never merely soldiers, for they had evolved into the medieval world's first multinational corporation, operating a sophisticated system of credit, deposit, and transfer, which allowed kings and nobles to move vast sums across hostile territories without the risk of carrying bullion. And this financial mastery, while making them indispensable to monarchs like Philip the Fair of France, also made them deeply resented, for they were perceived as an unaccountable, supranational entity that answered only to the Pope. And their vast land holdings across Europe, comprising thousands of manors, castles, vineyards, and entire fortified towns, represented a concentration of wealth that inevitably attracted the covetous gaze of every debt-ridden prince in Christendom. The King of France, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, not for his mercy but for his striking appearance, was by 1307 the most indebted monarch in Europe. He had borrowed astronomical sums from the Templars to finance his endless wars against England and Flanders, and his treasury was so depleted that he faced the real prospect of bankruptcy. Yet, rather than honor his obligations, this cunning and ruthless sovereign conceived a far more expedient solution, namely the complete destruction of his creditors. For if the Templars could be eliminated, not only would his debts be erased, but their immense wealth would revert to the crown. And this simple, brutal calculus formed the bedrock of the conspiracy that would unfold with theatrical precision on the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307. On that fateful day, Philip's agents, operating under sealed orders that had been distributed to every provincial bailiff and seneschal in France, broke into every Templar preceptory simultaneously, arresting hundreds of knights, sergeants, and chaplains. And the operation was executed with such secrecy and coordination that not a single warning escaped the order's intelligence network, which was otherwise renowned for its efficiency. And this complete surprise was the first critical factor in their overnight vanishing. For a military order that had withstood Saracen arrows and Mamluk cavalry was utterly defenseless against the sudden, silent grip of royal justice in their own dormitories. Yet the arrests alone would have been insufficient to destroy the Templars, for they possessed powerful allies in Rome and had weathered political storms before. And this is where Philip's Machiavellian genius truly shone. For he did not rely merely on force, but on a carefully crafted propaganda campaign that painted the Templars as heretics, sodomites, and blasphemers. They allegedly spat upon the cross during their secret initiation rites. They allegedly worshipped a mysterious bearded idol called Baphomet, and they allegedly engaged in obscene kisses upon the lower spine of their new recruits. These accusations, however preposterous they may seem to modern eyes, were extracted through the most brutal methods of interrogation. The torture included the strappado, where the victim's arms were tied behind his back and he was hoisted into the air, dislocating his shoulders. It included the application of red-hot irons to the soles of the feet. It included the slow crushing of fingers and toes in wooden vices. It included starvation and sleep deprivation for days on end. And under this relentless agony, even the bravest knights confessed to whatever their inquisitors demanded. They confessed to heresy. They confessed to idolatry. They confessed to unspeakable sexual perversions. And these confessions were then meticulously recorded and circulated across Europe, read from pulpits in every major cathedral, and printed in pamphlets distributed to the illiterate masses through town criers. The psychological impact was devastating. Public opinion, which had once revered the Templars as the champions of Christendom, now turned violently against them. They were seen as wolves in sheep's clothing. They were seen as a cancer within the body of the Church. And this propaganda war was the second critical factor in their overnight vanishing, for it destroyed their moral authority. It made any defense of the order politically toxic, and it silenced their potential champions among the nobility. However, Philip knew that France alone could not condemn an order that was directly subject to the Pope. He needed the complicity of the Vatican. He needed the Pope to officially dissolve the Templars and transfer their assets to another order. And this brings us to the third critical factor, which was the tragic weakness of Pope Clement V. Clement V was a Frenchman by birth. He had been elected pope largely through the influence of Philip himself, and he resided not in Rome, but in Avignon, under the shadow of French power. He was a sickly, indecisive, and frightened man. He was deeply aware that Philip had the military might to arrest him, imprison him, or even murder him if he defied the royal will. And when Philip presented the confessions of the Templars to Clement, the Pope was caught in an impossible dilemma. On one hand, he could defend the Templars and risk open war with the most powerful king in Europe. On the other hand, he could condemn them and betray an order that had been the special favorite of the papacy for nearly 200 years. And in the end, Clement chose survival over principle. He issued a papal bull called Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, which ordered all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their own territories. He summoned the Grand Master of the Temple, Jacques de Molay, and other high officials to appear before a papal commission. He suspended the order's privileges. He froze their assets. And he did all this while publicly protesting his love for the Templars and his belief in their eventual innocence. But his actions spoke far louder than his words. For by cooperating with Philip's arrests, Clement gave the entire operation the veneer of papal legitimacy. He transformed a French royal vendetta into an official inquisition of the universal church. This was the third critical factor. It made the Templars fugitives in their own lands. It stripped them of their legal protections, and it handed their enemies a blank check for persecution. Yet even with Philip's armies, Philip's propaganda, and Philip's puppet pope, the Templars might have survived if they had presented a united front of defiance. This they failed to do. Their leadership under Jacques de Molay committed a series of catastrophic strategic blunders. De Molay, after his arrest, immediately confessed to the charges. He confessed not under extreme torture, but after relatively mild pressure. He signed a written confession that admitted to denying Christ during his initiation.
He admitted to spitting on the cross. He admitted to the indecent kiss. This confession was a gift to Philip. It seemed to confirm every vile accusation that had been circulated. It demoralized the rank and file of the order. It made resistance seem futile. Many other Templar leaders followed de Molay's example.
They confessed, recanted, confessed again, and recanted again in a bewildering cycle of weakness and defiance. This inconsistency destroyed their credibility. It convinced the papal commissioners that the Templars were indeed a confused, divided, and guilty organization. The order failed to coordinate any effective legal defense. They failed to rally their vast wealth to hire the best lawyers in Europe.
They failed to appeal to the secular princes of England, Spain, Portugal, and Germany, many of whom were sympathetic and could have offered sanctuary. Instead, they waited passively for the papal verdict. This passivity was the fourth critical factor in their overnight vanishing. The final and perhaps most decisive blow came from the geopolitical reality of the early 14th century. The Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land had fallen.
Acre, the last Christian stronghold, had been lost in 1291. The Templars' primary raison d'etre, the protection of pilgrims and the defense of Jerusalem, no longer existed. They had failed in their sacred mission. They had retreated to the island of Cyprus and to their European estates. They had become warriors without a war. They had become defenders without a frontier.
In this new Europe, the great monarchies of France, England, and Aragon were consolidating their power. They were building centralized bureaucracies and standing armies. They did not want autonomous military orders that owed allegiance to a foreign pope. They did not want international banks that could manipulate their currencies and call in their debts. They did not want secretive societies that operated outside the law of the realm.
The Templars were an anachronism. They belonged to the age of crusading zeal and feudal independence. That age was dead. The new age belonged to the nation-state. It belonged to the king's justice. It belonged to the royal treasury. In this new age, the Templars had no natural allies. They had no essential function. They were, in the cold calculus of power, simply too rich, too independent, and too vulnerable to.
The actual mechanics of their disappearance were executed with grim efficiency over the years from 1307 to 1314. Hundreds of Templars were burned at the stake in France. Others were imprisoned for life in damp, dark dungeons. Their properties were confiscated and transferred to the rival order of the Knights Hospitaller, though much of the wealth conveniently ended up in Philip's own coffers. In England, King Edward II initially resisted the arrests. He dismissed the charges as slander. He wrote letters to Pope Clement defending the Templars' honor, but he was ultimately bullied into compliance. He ordered the arrests in 1308. He subjected the Templars to interrogation, but torture was used sparingly. Most English Templars confessed to nothing and were eventually allowed to retire to monasteries.
They disappeared quietly into obscurity, never to be heard from again. In Spain and Portugal, the Templars were largely acquitted of heresy. They simply changed their name and uniform. They became the Order of Christ in Portugal and the Order of Montesa in Aragon. They continued their military and naval activities for centuries, but they were no longer the Templars. Their identity was erased. Their history was rewritten. Their memory was suppressed. The final act of this drama took place on March 18, 1314, in Paris. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, were brought before a papal commission to receive their final sentence. They had previously confessed. They had been condemned to life imprisonment. But at the last moment, as the cardinals read out the verdict, de Molay stood up and spoke.
He declared that he and his order were innocent of all charges. He declared that his earlier confessions were false, extracted by torture and fear. He declared that the Templars were a holy, Catholic, and apostolic order. He proclaimed his readiness to die for the truth. This dramatic recantation was an act of tremendous courage. It was also an act of suicide. Philip was enraged by this public defiance. He ordered de Molay and de Charny to be burned alive that very evening. They were taken to a small island in the Seine River, the Ile de la Cité. They were tied to stakes. Wood and faggots were piled around their feet. As the flames rose, de Molay prayed aloud. He asked God to judge the Pope and the King. He called them to answer before the divine tribunal within 40 days. His voice was consumed by the fire. His body was reduced to ashes.
His bones were ground to dust and scattered in the river. The legend says that Pope Clement V died of a wasting illness exactly 40 days later. It says that King Philip died in a hunting accident exactly 40 days after that. Both stories are historically disputed, but they persist in the popular imagination. They testify to the belief that justice, however delayed, is never entirely denied.
The Templars vanished overnight, in the sense that their corporate existence was annihilated in a few short years. Their Grand Master was dead. Their hierarchy was decapitated. Their treasury was looted. Their records were destroyed. Their castles were demolished or handed over to their rivals. Their surviving members were either killed, imprisoned, or absorbed into other orders. No new recruits were admitted. No new commanders were appointed.
No general chapters were convened. The machinery of their governance simply stopped functioning. It was as if a great oak tree had been struck by lightning and reduced to charcoal in a single afternoon. The roots were still underground. The seeds were still scattered in the soil. But the visible trunk, the mighty branches, and the spreading canopy were gone forever. Why did this happen so fast?
The answer lies in the convergence of multiple factors that reinforced each other. Philip's greed provided the motive. His secret police provided the means. His propaganda provided the justification. Clement's cowardice provided the cover. De Molay's blunders provided the weaknesses. The loss of Jerusalem provided the context. The rise of national monarchies provided the final, irrevocable judgment.
Each of these factors alone would have been dangerous. Together, they were lethal. The Templars were not defeated in battle. They were not destroyed by a foreign invader. They were not dissolved by a theological schism. They were killed by a conspiracy between a desperate king and a compliant pope. They were executed by the very civilization they had sworn to defend. This is the tragedy of their overnight vanishing.
It was not a natural death. It was a judicial murder. It was a political assassination carried out with the full apparatus of medieval statecraft. The Templars vanished because power abhors a rival. They vanished because money never sleeps and debtors never forgive. They vanished because the age of the warrior monk had passed and the age of the absolute prince had begun.
They vanished because the cross they wore on their white mantles was no longer a symbol of pilgrimage and piety. It had become a target for every envious lord and every bankrupt king in Europe. Their disappearance was swift, total, and ruthless. It serves as a warning to every institution that grows too powerful, too wealthy, and too independent of the secular sword. It reminds us that no order, however holy, is immune to the greed and ambition of mortal rulers. It teaches us that the most dangerous enemy of a great institution is not the heretic or the infidel, it is the sovereign who owes it money. In the end, the Knights Templar vanished overnight because they had made themselves indispensable and therefore unbearable. They had lent too much. They had guarded too many secrets. They had accumulated too much land. They had answered to a distant pope instead of a present king. They had failed to adapt to a changing world. They had trusted in their own invincibility. They had forgotten that the same financial genius that made them rich also made them a target. The same military discipline that made them feared also made them isolated. The same papal protection that made them secure also made them vulnerable to papal betrayal. When the storm came, they had nowhere to run. They had no army to defend them. They had no fortress that could withstand the siege of royal law. They had no alliance that could save them from the rope and the fire. Their overnight vanishing was not an accident. It was not a mystery. It was the logical, inevitable outcome of their own success. It was the price they paid for 2 centuries of unchallenged power. And when the smoke cleared, when the ashes cooled, when the last confessor was strangled in his cell, the world moved on. The Templars became a legend. They became a myth. They became a treasure lost beneath the sands of time. But the real treasure was always there, visible in the castles they built, the roads they traveled, and the banking system they pioneered.
They vanished overnight, but their ghost has never truly left us. It haunts every conspiracy theory, every historical novel, and every secret society that claims descent from their ancient rites. It reminds us that power, once accumulated, is never forgotten.
The Knights Templar vanished overnight, but the reasons for their disappearance are written in the blood of their martyred Grand Master and in the gold that Philip the Fair took from their temples. They are written in the papal bulls that condemned them and in the royal decrees that dissolved them. They are written in the silence of their empty preceptories and in the ruins of their abandoned fortresses.
That silence speaks louder than any battle cry. It tells us that no institution is eternal. It tells us that every empire has its appointed hour. It tells us that the seeds of destruction are often sown in the very moment of greatest triumph. The Templars triumphed too well. They dominated too completely. They frightened too many powerful men. And for that, they were condemned to disappear.
Not gradually, not gracefully, but violently, suddenly, and forever. That is the true story of why the Knights Templar vanished overnight. It is not a story of magic or mystery. It is a story of human nature, of greed and fear and ambition. It is a story that repeats itself in every age, in every country, and in every institution that dares to rise above the common herd. The Templars rose higher than any. They fell harder than any.
And their fall, though swift, was never inexplicable. It was written in the stars of political calculation. It was sealed in the dungeons of Paris. It was consumed in the flames of the Ile de la Cité. And it remains, even now, a timeless lesson in the fragility of earthly glory. That is why they vanished. That is why they vanished overnight.
That is why their name, once a byword for courage and sanctity, became a byword for tragedy and betrayal.
They vanished because they were too powerful for their own good. They vanished because the world was not ready for them. They vanished because, in the end, even the bravest knights cannot escape the long arm of royal justice when it is guided by the twin demons of debt and desperation. And so they are gone. But they are not forgotten. They have vanished, but their mystery endures.
Their story ends, but it begins again with every question asked by every historian, every poet, and every dreamer who wonders how a force so mighty could dissolve into nothingness in the space of a single generation. That is the answer. That is the truth. That is why the Knights Templar vanished overnight.